The other thing that we wanted to do is really put in the front end, instead of in a workshop tomorrow, there's a million of them, we wanted to put right up front the basic needs stuff and explain to you why we want to build a framework that puts basic needs, things like internet connections and food and housing and health, right at the front of our model. So one of the things we did is we asked Rachelle Lyons, who has been heading the Basic Needs Working Group over the last year at Plymouth and does lots of work, particularly with Casey Crafton and Jess Dutil in the Office of Community Impact, to talk just a little bit about some of what our students are facing with basic needs. I didn't check, so I'm just praying that somewhere in this big crowd is Rachelle, who could unmute now and pop in. And I'll just move your slides for you, Rachelle, so just give me a ping when you want them.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I wove in some animations, and I guess that's something I should have thought through, and I'm not actually controlling how these slides progress, but this is really just broad strokes about basic needs, and I'll be having some drop-in hours if anyone wants any additional information or connection to resources or deeper discussion about what basic needs look like and mean for the success of Plymouth State University and our students. So I'm sure that many of you are familiar with Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and this is what we're touching on, but a more modern version of this also includes access to education, technology, and healthcare. It's important to recognize right now that many of our students may not have access to technology or healthcare, and they may not be in a safe situation. They may be struggling with access to food. I hate to say it, even access to water for sanitation, which is so critical right now. So you can only imagine what the stress level is like when you have those types of concerns. And this is not just a social justice issue, this is very much an academic issue. Students who are in low income situations are about 15 times more likely to fail a course. And then there's research out of several places, but primarily the University of Wisconsin and the University of Michigan, that have shown that about 10% of students end up dropping out, or what we're calling stopping out, due to unexpected expenses that are less than $1,000. And we'll talk more about that in a second. So to put this in context of what's the experience for many of our Plymouth State students, about 30% of PSU students are Pell eligible. And I know we use that term a lot, but what it really means is that a family of 4 is living on an income of just under $50,000. That's 200% of the poverty level. It's pretty challenging to imagine living in New Hampshire on an income of just under $50,000 and trying to put two students through college. In addition to that, about 43% of our students are first generation, so they're the first in their family to actually attend some form of higher education. And that means that there's a lot less fluency and support for how to navigate the structures of higher ed. It's been put to me in an analogy as though these students are climbing up the down escalator. And then when we layer on these national trends that we're seeing with COVID-19 fallout, I'm sure you've seen some of these figures, but over 20 million Americans have lost their jobs. That's an unemployment rate of about 14%, which is more than we've ever seen as a nation, more than we saw during the Great Depression. Some of the areas that are hardest hit by this unemployment, of course, are service industries. And this is where many of our students and their parents are working. So students are out of work, and their parents are very likely out of work too. Our students also probably experience some loss of income because the opportunities for work study were ripped out from under them. And our students were also most likely not eligible to receive the care funds that were distributed, that $1,200 one-time payment. And then we also have to consider that when students are losing jobs and parents are losing jobs, a lot of times that also means that they have all of a sudden lost their health care, or they have an expense of around $500 per person to continue their health care through COBRA. So these are really intense stressors that you can see would easily take precedence over needing to submit a paper by the exact deadline. And if you're wondering like, okay, this is heartbreaking, but is it really an academic issue? Well, we talk a lot about PSU, about retention, and here's some data I can show you to illustrate that this is definitely a retention issue. We have a chart here that shows the 1-year retention rate across all of the USNH institutions, but I want to draw your attention particularly to PSU. If you want to click, Robin, it'll show some arrows. So this is the PSU specific information, and it shows 1-year retention rates for all of our students. So in 2018, it was a 69% retention rate. But then when we look over to see those retention rates for Pell eligible and first gen students, it's lower than the overall rate. And sometimes that gap between all peers and the Pell eligible and first gen students is a little bit wider. But we know that our Pell eligible first gen and undeclared students are the ones who are most likely to drop out. And it's likely because of the additional stressors and threats of living in a precarious situation. Okay. This right here tells us that we have to address basic needs if we are serious about addressing retention and improving student success. So there are a lot of wonderful programs at PSU. You may have heard of some of these. We had FAST funds that just came out through the CoLab right at the outset of the COVID-19. We do offer emergency funds right now through the institution for students, faculty, and staff. But these challenges are not a result just of COVID-19 fallout. These trends have been on our campus for a long time. COVID-19 has certainly exacerbated some of these challenges. The Student Support Foundation is an organization on campus that does quite a lot to address basic needs. They offer a community cupboard in the hub, which provides some additional food. There's also many distributed small scale food pantries on campus. And if you'd like to start one in your building, let me know. But all of these services are certainly not enough. What we saw with Student Support Foundation after COVID-19 was that requests for small emergency grants more than doubled. So in the course of a year, there might be about 49 requests for these small emergency grants, which are limited to $400. And students can request for things like textbooks, utility payments, maybe unexpected medical expenses. So those requests are now over 100. I would also say that there is one individual who manages the programming of the Student Support Foundation, and it is largely a student-run organization, but we have one staff member who really lifts quite a heavy burden to deliver all of those services and help the students who run Student Support Foundation be effective. And it's worth noting that that individual has been furloughed, so we are kind of in a scramble to continue to provide those services that come through Student Support Foundation without that staff time and effort to deliver that programming. I think it's also important to note that one of the biggest requests that Student Support Foundation sees in those mini grants is to support the purchase of textbooks and access codes. And this is a great lever for faculty. So as you are designing your courses for the fall, knowing that our students are in an even more precarious position, can we find ways to help relieve a little bit of that pressure and expense that comes with textbooks and access codes? Some things that faculty can consider is just staying informed about what are the trends and concerns with basic needs and what are some of the creative ways that other institutions have been responding. And we do have a small working group, a basic needs working group. And if anyone is interested in being tuned into that or being a part of that, we are certainly interested in engaging more of the faculty. As faculty members, you can also make referrals to the Student Support Foundation. And I think one of the most important pieces is to recognize that our students do face challenges that can very easily make them seem like they are not engaged, when in fact it's not a question of engagement, but a question of opportunity to engage, and how they are sometimes precluded from that because of things like having to work. Students aren't just working so that they have a little bit of spending money in their pocket. Many students are working because they're also contributing to the financial well-being of the household. They're working because they need to be able to purchase food. They're working because they need to be able to pay for an internet bill. So it's not necessarily a luxury, but an absolute requirement. So as a faculty member, remembering to be human and try to be in touch with the idea that these students oftentimes are facing incredible challenges and huge hurdles just to be able to make it to class and have enough bandwidth to be present. So if we can design our courses with this in mind, we can also be improving student success. One of the other big pieces faculty can contribute to is advocating. So whose responsibility is it to address basic needs on our campus? And there's no one single right answer to this question, but I think if we're being honest with ourselves as humans and as academics who are interested in the success of the institution, we have to recognize that this is a tremendous threat, not just to our students who are experiencing the struggle, but to our institution as a whole, and truly to higher ed as a whole. I think we need to make it visible if we do believe that addressing basic needs are important. Are we saying that? Are we expressing that? And are we doing that in meaningful ways that then beget some sort of response that will truly start to address the need? Of the 47 plus retention and persistent initiatives, ideas that were generated in 2018 and 2019, none of them directly address basic needs.
Thank you, Rachelle.
Space.
I want to continue this conversation, if I can click, by showing some of your responses to the question of, you know, how did it go over the spring when you were doing emergency remote teaching? And I want to specifically look at internet access. We don't often think about internet access as a basic need. Some organizations at this point do call connectivity a basic human right. So it's actually really interesting, depending on where you live, how internet is characterized. But certainly we can think about it in, if remote learning is a requirement, then it is a need that's pretty basic to your success at Plymouth. And some of what we heard over the spring was that many people suffered from connectivity issues. So you can see people, the first one was particularly about synchronous Zooms with students having trouble managing the bandwidth for synchronous Zooming, and people having in general trouble with access to connectivity. You can see the pink one down below. This is from a faculty member who said, like, we have literally the best internet that you could have. We have good download speeds, but with 2 working adults and 3 school-aged children, and all of these requirements for synchronous Zooming and stuff, the household couldn't support all of the streaming. So even some people who normally would consider themselves pretty well set up, in this scenario, depending on users in the household, weren't okay. The bottom one is from a faculty member who had some failures with synchronous learning because her internet connection was not stable enough to manage the things that she wanted to do for her class. And we actually had faculty who had no internet connection that were struggling because in general, they had come to work to do their internet things before. And now that was a little bit more challenging, even though they could still come to the office here and there. So part of the question that we are raising is, if we're all going to go remote for some part of some semester, which is part of possible contingencies, what are we going to do about these basic gaps, including the food and the housing, which is what I actually spent more time on with IDS students than anything else. It was food and housing. I was making sure they had food. I was making sure they were living somewhere. I will tell you that tomorrow we have at least 3 sessions that are focused on this stuff. For example, there is a session tomorrow called What If My Student Has No Internet? And so if you want to take a deeper dive into these, you can look through the schedule for tomorrow. But we put the basic needs at the front because we don't think any of the other things we're talking about make sense unless we're thinking about how basic needs are met before we enter into the other conversations. So we're going to try to keep that in the foreground as we move forward into some of the modalities that we're going to talk about now.